When I walked into the barn that February morning, I found my father-in-law Robert collapsed in the hay, his lips tinged blue in the dim light filtering through the snow-covered windows. The thermos of hot chocolate I'd made him just 2 hours earlier sat empty on the wooden workbench beside his favorite carving tools. I should have known then. I should have seen it. But after 45 years of marriage, you stop questioning the small things. You trust. And that trust nearly killed me. My name is Margaret. I'm 62 years old, and this is the story of how I almost became another statistic, another wife who died mysteriously in her sleep, leaving everything to a husband who'd been planning her death for months. It started 3 years ago when Robert, my father-in-law, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He was 80 years old, sharp as a tack, until suddenly he wasn't. David, my husband, was his only child. We'd been living in Chicago where David worked as a real estate consultant, but when Robert got sick, we moved back to the family farm in rural Wisconsin, 500 acres of land that had been in the Hansen family for 4 generations. I gave up my job as a kindergarten teacher to care for Robert. We never had children of our own, and I'd always been close to my father-in-law. He taught me how to ride horses when I first married David. He taught me the names of every wildflower that grew in the meadow behind the barn. When I lost my own father 10 years ago, Robert held my hand at the funeral and told me I'd always have a dad as long as he was alive. So I stayed. I bathed him when he forgot how. I reminded him who I was on the days his memory failed. I made his meals, managed his medications, and sat with him for hours while he told me stories from his childhood, the same stories over and over, and I listened each time like it was the first. David went back to Chicago most weeks for work. He'd leave Monday morning and return Friday night. At first, I thought nothing of it. We needed the income, and his consulting business was thriving. But over the months, his Friday returns got later. He'd walk in at 11, midnight, sometimes 1 in the morning. "Is everything all right at the office?" I'd ask. "Fine," he'd say, not looking at me, "just busy." The way he said it made something in my chest tighten, but I pushed it away. We'd been married 45 years. You don't throw away 45 years over suspicions and feelings. You trust your husband. You believe him when he says he's working late. The first real sign came in November, about 6 months ago. Robert had a good day, one of those rare days where the fog lifted and he was completely himself. We were sitting in the kitchen, and I'd just served him his afternoon hot chocolate. He loved hot chocolate, had drunk it every day of his adult life, winter and summer. "Margaret," he said, and his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in months. "I need to tell you something about David." I sat down across from him. "What is it?" He leaned forward. "There's a woman." I saw them together when he thought I was sleeping. Young thing, couldn't be more than 35. They were in my study, looking at papers, land surveys, property deeds. "Are you sure?" I asked, even as my heart started to pound. "I've lived 80 years. I know what I saw." He squeezed my hand. "Be careful, Margaret. That boy's got his mother's ambition and none of her morals." I didn't know what to do with that information. The next day, Robert didn't remember the conversation. He barely remembered who I was. I told myself maybe it was the Alzheimer's talking. Maybe he'd confused David with someone from a TV show or a dream. But I started paying attention. I noticed David had new clothes, expensive shirts I'd never seen before. I noticed he started wearing cologne, something woody and sophisticated that I'd never smelled on him. I noticed how he looked at his phone constantly, texting with a small smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. In December, he started talking about selling the farm. "It's too much for you," he said one night over dinner. "Taking care of Dad, maintaining this place. We should sell, move to a condo in Madison. Put Dad in a facility where professionals can care for him." I stared at him. "This is his home, David. Your family's home for 4 generations. I promised him he could die here." "He's not going to know the difference," David said coldly. "And we need the money." We're not struggling financially." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand the business, Margaret. Just trust me on this." But I didn't trust him. Not anymore. I started going through his phone when he slept. I know it was wrong, an invasion of privacy, but that conversation with Robert kept echoing in my head. "Be careful, Margaret." That's when I found the messages. Hundreds of them, going back over a year. Her name was Ashley. She was 36 years old and worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep. She'd sold David's company on a new prescription benefits plan. That's how they met. The early messages were professional, then flirty, then explicit. I sat in our bedroom at 3 a.m, reading about my husband's affair with shaking hands and a burning throat. They talked about a future together, about traveling to Italy, about the life they'd have once David was free. Once he was free, I kept scrolling, looking for what that meant. The messages were vague, careful, but then I found one from October. Everything's in place. R won't know the difference. His doctors already expect decline. My blood went cold. R. Robert. His doctors already expect decline. What had David done? I thought about Robert's medications. I organized them every week, dozens of pills and a complicated schedule his neurologist had prescribed. David had recently insisted on handling the evening medications himself, said it would give me a break. I'd been grateful. God help me, I'd been grateful. I went down to Robert's room that night. He was sleeping, snoring softly. I gathered his medication bottles and took them to my room. In the morning, I'd call his doctor. But morning never came. Not for Robert. At 6 a.m., I woke to David shaking me. Dad's not in his bed. I've looked everywhere. We found him in the barn. He loved that barn, had built it himself in 1982. Even with the Alzheimer's, he'd wander out there in the early morning, running his hands over the wood, checking on the old horses we still kept. He was lying in the hay near the workbench. His skin was cold. The paramedics came, but everyone could see he was gone. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, likely brought on by the cold. Robert had walked out in his pajamas, something Alzheimer's patients did, and his heart had simply given out. Except Robert never walked anywhere without his slippers. And his slippers were in his room. Someone had carried him out there. And that thermos of hot chocolate I'd made him at 4 a.m. I hadn't made any hot chocolate. I'd been asleep until David woke me at 6. At the funeral, David was devastated. He cried during the service, gave a beautiful eulogy about his father's legacy and love. People patted his shoulder, told him he was a good son for bringing his dad home to die. I said nothing. I watched him. I watched how his grief never quite reached his eyes. 3 days after the funeral, a lawyer showed up at our door. His name was Martin Prescott, and he carried a leather briefcase and an oily smile. "Mrs. Hanson," he said, shaking my hand with fingers that felt like cold fish, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm here to discuss your father-in-law's estate." We sat in the living room, David, the lawyer, and me. Martin pulled out papers. "Robert's will is very straightforward," he said. "The farm and all assets go to David, his sole heir. However, there are some complications with the property title. To simplify the transfer, we need Margaret to sign these quitclaim deeds." I looked at David. "Quitclaim deeds? It's standard," David said quickly. "Just a formality to make sure everything's in order." I picked up the papers. They weren't quitclaims for the transfer from Robert to David. They were quitclaims for my share, my marital share of the property. If I signed these, I'd have no legal claim to the farm. David would own it outright. "Why would I need to sign away my marital property?" I asked. Martin smiled. "Well, technically, as I mentioned, there are some complications." I looked at David. "What complications?" His face reddened. "Just sign the papers, Margaret. You said yourself you don't understand business matters. Then explain it to me." The room went silent. Martin cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a break. Let you review everything with your own attorney." "No," David said sharply. "We're signing today." Something in his voice made me go very still. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the man I'd married 45 years ago. This wasn't the man who'd cried on our wedding night because he was so happy. This was someone else wearing his face. "I need to think about this," I said. "Think about what?" David's voice rose. "It's my father's farm. My inheritance. You're just being difficult." I stood up. "Get out of my house." Martin grabbed his briefcase. "Mrs. Hanson, perhaps we can reschedule. Both of you. Get out." David didn't leave. He stayed through the lawyer's hurried exit, then turned on me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to my own ears. Your father dies mysteriously, and 3 days later you're trying to steal my half of this property. What do you think is wrong with me, David?" His face went white. "You can't be suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying I want my own lawyer to look at these papers before I sign anything." We stood there, husband and wife, staring at each other like enemies. "Fine," he said finally. "Fine. But you're going to regret making this difficult, Margaret." He stormed out. I heard his car start, heard him peel out of the driveway, spraying gravel. I sat down on the couch and started to shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that thermos of hot chocolate, about Robert's slippers in his room, about David insisting I sign away my rights to the farm, about those messages. "Everything's in place. R won't know the difference. His doctors already expect decline." At 2 a.m., I went down to the barn. I'd been avoiding it since we found Robert, but I needed to see it again. I needed to understand. I brought a flashlight and walked through the cold. It had snowed again, covering our footprints from that morning. The barn was dark and silent. I stood where we'd found Robert, shining my light around. That's when I saw it. A small security camera mounted in the corner near the workbench. I'd forgotten about it. David had installed cameras around the property last year after some equipment went missing. We'd caught the neighbor's teenage son, gotten our stuff back, and I'd forgotten the cameras existed. My heart started pounding. Did the cameras still work? Did they record? I ran back to the house, to David's study. The security system monitor was there, dusty and half hidden behind books on a shelf. I turned it on. The cameras were still running, still recording. They saved footage to a cloud server. I logged in using David's password, the same password he'd used for everything for 20 years, Hansen1978. I pulled up the barn camera for the morning Robert died. At 4:47 a.m., the camera showed David entering the barn. He was carrying Robert over his shoulder like a sack of grain. Robert was alive but barely conscious, his head lolling. David laid him in the hay, arranged his body, then pulled out a thermos from his jacket. He propped Robert up and held the thermos to his lips, forcing him to drink. Robert tried to push it away, but David held his head, made him swallow. I watched my husband of 45 years, kill his father with hot chocolate. When the thermos was empty, David set it on the workbench. He stood over Robert for a moment, watching. Then he checked his watch and left. Robert died alone in the hay. It took 12 minutes. I watched the timestamp. I watched him struggle, and then go still. I downloaded the video with shaking hands. Then I kept searching. There were other cameras, one in the mudroom, one in the kitchen. I found footage from the past 6 months. David slipping extra pills into Robert's evening medications, pills that weren't prescribed, pills that made Robert more confused, more docile. I saw him crushing something white into Robert's hot chocolate on dozens of occasions, stirring it in, then handing the cup to his father with a smile. I saw more. I saw David meeting with Martin, the lawyer in the study, spreading out property documents. I saw Ashley visit once when I'd been at the grocery store, saw her hand David a pharmacy bag, saw him kiss her and promise it would be over soon. Then I found the footage that made me understand everything. From 2 weeks before Robert died, David and Ashley in the kitchen, late at night. I'd been asleep upstairs. The camera caught their conversation. "Are you sure about the dosage?" David asked. Ashley rolled her eyes. "I'm a pharmaceutical rep, honey. Trust me. With the medications he's already on, this will look like natural causes. Organ failure, maybe a stroke. The Alzheimer's covers everything. And after? After, we sell the farm, get the money, and start our life. You said the property's worth at least $3 million, right? 3.5. But Margaret owns half his marital property. That's the problem." Ashley smirked. "Not if she dies too." My blood turned to ice. I watched David nod slowly. "But we have to be careful. We can't have 2 deaths close together. So do her after the farm sells. Make it look like an accident. She takes care of horses, right? Horses are dangerous. She could fall, get kicked, hit her head." They talked for another 10 minutes, planning my death like discussing dinner plans. When Ashley left, she kissed David at the door. "Happy early anniversary, babe. 1 more year, and you'll be free." I sat in that study until dawn, watching videos, downloading everything. Then I called the police. The detective who came was a woman in her 50s named Sarah Chen. I showed her everything, the videos, the messages, the medications I'd kept from Robert's room, which she'd have tested for additional substances. She watched the footage of Robert's death 3 times. Then she looked at me with something like pity in her eyes. "Mrs. Hanson," she said gently, "where is your husband now?" "He left yesterday afternoon. He's been staying in a hotel in town since the funeral." "And this woman, Ashley?" "I have her information from the phone messages." Detective Chen called for backup. Within 2 hours, they had David and Ashley in custody. The toxicology report on Robert's body confirmed it. High levels of digoxin, a heart medication that, in large doses, causes cardiac arrest. Ashley had been stealing it from pharmaceutical samples at her job. Mixed with Robert's other medications and administered over months, it had slowly poisoned him while looking like natural Alzheimer's decline. The hot chocolate that morning had been the final dose, enough to stop his heart. But here's what I didn't know. What came out during the trial? David hadn't planned to kill Robert that morning. The original plan was slower, another few months of gradual poisoning. But Robert had done something that scared them. The day before he died, during one of his lucid moments, he'd called his own lawyer and asked to change his will. He wanted to leave the farm to me, not David. The lawyer was scheduled to come to the house the next day with new paperwork. David found out about the appointment. He panicked, and he decided to speed up the timeline. What David didn't know was that Robert had been more aware than anyone realized. That notebook Detective Chen found in his room? Robert had been documenting everything, dates when he felt especially confused, times when David brought him drinks. He'd written, "David is killing me. Tell Margaret." He'd tried to warn me. That conversation in November, when he told me about the woman and the land surveys he'd known. Some part of him, even through the fog of disease, had understood his son was planning to kill him. And in the end, he'd tried to protect himself by changing the will. It's what got him killed. But there's more. This is the part that still gives me nightmares. During the investigation, they searched David's hotel room. They found another thermos. This one was labeled with my name on a piece of tape. Detective Chen had it tested. It was full of hot chocolate laced with enough digoxin to kill me 3 times over. David's plan had been simple. After I signed the papers giving him the farm, he'd come home to reconcile. He'd apologize for pushing me, say he was just grief-stricken about his father. He'd make my favorite dinner, and we'd have hot chocolate together afterward, like we used to on winter nights. I'd go to sleep, and I'd never wake up. By the time anyone found me, he'd have ownership of the farm. The hot chocolate thermos would be washed and put away. It would look like I'd died of a heart attack, just like Robert. Grief, people would say. She died of a broken heart after losing her father-in-law. David and Ashley would wait a respectful 6 months. Then they'd sell the farm, take the $3.5 million, and start their new life together. I survived because I paid attention, because Robert warned me, even when his mind was failing, because I didn't sign those papers. I survived because David killed his father first, and that gave me time to find the truth. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos alone were enough, but combined with the toxicology reports, the phone messages, the medications, Robert's notebook, there was no defense. David got life without parole for murder and attempted murder. Ashley got 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder and for stealing the digoxin. During sentencing, David looked at me across the courtroom. Even then, even after everything, I thought I might see remorse. Some flicker of the man I'd loved for 45 years. But there was nothing, just cold calculation in his eyes. He'd tried to kill me, and his only regret was that he'd failed. I inherited the farm, not because Robert changed his will, he died before the new one was signed, but because under Wisconsin law, when someone tries to kill their spouse, they forfeit all inheritance rights. David got nothing. I spent the first month after the trial in a fog. I'd wake up and forget everything had happened. I'd make coffee for 2 people. I'd turn to tell David something before remembering he was in prison for trying to murder me. But slowly, I found my way back. I turned the farm into something good. Robert's Haven, I called it. It's a residential therapy farm for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. We have medical staff, comfortable rooms, and acres of safe space for residents to walk and experience nature. We keep horses and chickens. We have a garden where residents can work if they're able. I named it after Robert because he saved my life. If he hadn't warned me that day in November, if he hadn't tried to change his will, if he hadn't written in that notebook, I'd be dead. David would have gotten away with it. Every morning, I make hot chocolate. Not from a thermos, but from scratch, the way Robert taught me years ago. Real cocoa, whole milk, a pinch of cinnamon. I make it for the residents, and we sit together in the sunroom, watching the snow fall on the fields. And I think about trust, about how you can live with someone for 45 years and not really know them, about how love can turn to greed, and how greed can turn to murder. But I also think about the other kind of love, the kind Robert had for me that made him fight through his failing mind to warn me, the kind that made him document his son's betrayal even when he barely remembered his own name. That's the love worth having. That's the love that saves you. So now, I drink my hot chocolate with people who might not remember me tomorrow, who might ask my name 5 times in an hour, who might tell me the same story about their childhood over and over again. And I listen every time like it's the first. Because really paying attention to people isn't just about catching poison in your drink. It's about honoring their humanity. It's about being present even when presence is hard. Robert taught me that, in life and in death. And David? David taught me that survival isn't just about avoiding danger. It's about choosing, every day, to be someone who deserves to survive, someone who cares for others. Someone who pays attention, not because they're looking for betrayal, but because love means witnessing another person's story. I'm 62 years old. I'm a widow and a survivor. I run a farm full of people whose memories are fading. But I remember everything, and I make sure they're safe. That's my story. Thank you for listening. If you've experienced betrayal in your family, know that you're not alone. And if someone you trust ever hands you something and insists you drink it, pay attention. Trust your instincts. They might save your life.